Good day, friends, and welcome to this third and final installment in a brief biography video on the life and times of St. Ignatius. Today's episode, in fact, doesn't talk too much about Ignatius, but rather it focuses on the works that he organized and managed from his headquarters in downtown Rome during the last 15 years of his life, a place he rarely ever left, but from that small corner of the city was able to dream great dreams and begin and manage large and complicated works, many of which still exist in one form or another even to this day. So as we prepare to celebrate his feast later this week, and as we prepare to continue our lives in these difficult times, we hope to be inspired by his example of service and of generosity, and we look forward to more encounters like this in the future. God bless you all, and thanks very much. In 1540, the Society of Jesus was approved by Pope Paul III in a papal bull. That papal bull gathered together the first inspirations of the companions and described the work that they planned to do, work for the good of the church and for the good of souls. Some months later, Ignatius was elected the first superior general of the society, and the first Jesuits began their ministries before the image of Our Lady at St. Paul outside the walls. From the very beginning, service of the poor was a definitive part of their ministries. Ignatius, after his vigil at Montserrat, gave his rich clothes to a beggar and swapped his clothing for the rags that the beggar was wearing. And that kind of generosity has been part of the Jesuit DNA ever since. Care for the poor, which is seen as a corporal work of mercy, yet that care includes other phases, not only direct assistance, as we see here in this very early engraving, but also the teaching of CATECHISM, the preaching of the gospel, the hearing of confessions. The ministries of the word were understood as an essential part of the Jesuit DNA. Ignatius's style was different from much rhetorical preaching of his time. He said that we study so that we can preach. But more than that, he insisted that his preachers, who would address congregations from the Pope and the College of Cardinals to Protestants in Germany and in the North, to ordinary people across the world, that preaching should be done in what he called the modo suave, sweetly and kindly, not looking for polemical arguments, but as a way of reaching out to people by finding what they knew and what they cared about, and then moving forward from points of agreement, and then only then addressing points of disagreement. A fine example of that, of course, we have today, the best example, in Pope Francis himself. That commitment to the poor, that commitment to social change is evident throughout the early society and from Ignatius's time when he opened up a house for reformed prostitutes close to his house and caught all kinds of criticism from people who thought that he was being too open and too forgiving. He instituted a home for the daughters of prostitutes so that they wouldn't have to follow in their mother's footsteps. Homes for orphans, for Jewish catechumens, centers for reconciliation among arguing families, between feuding families, a huge influence or a huge commitment to the hearing of confessions, work in hospitals, work in prisons. So those social mysteries usually centered around a church with the adjacent college became definitive parts of the society's way of operating. Ignatius, moreover, very early on, really from the beginnings, saw the importance of lay partnership. He reached out to people who could help him in those works, and many of those works which were directly of social assistance were turned over after a foundational period to lay partners to manage and to direct. He was also mindful of the needs that he had to support his community, and was no stranger to fundraising. In fact, he was very good at that, often putting a huge effort into writing and the curation of his benefactors. The Jesuits were preachers. They went out and did parish and diocesan missions. They preached on street corners. Here we see Ignatius preaching in his hometown of Loyola on his way before his ordination, and an ironical engraving on the right, but done in Protestant English, showing a Jesuit preaching against our Bible, tearing the Bible up and throwing it off, and someone in the congregation is saying, "You lie." So there was a deal of polemicism even there. The teaching of the Catechism is one of the defining works from the earliest documents, and they did it with great creativity. You name it, they did it. They taught with books, famous editions of the Catechism that went through multiple versions, especially St. Peter Canisius's, and multiple translations, with pamphlets, with songs, with little ditties that they taught to children, through plays, and through very practical moral lessons rather than a lot of speculation. If you say the word Jesuit to most people, they consider the work of the Society of Jesus in the area of education. The Jesuits were not founded to be an order of schoolmasters, but they backed into that because people came to them seeing that they were well-trained and well-prepared and flexible and able to address the culture in which they lived. People came to them and asked that they would work with their families and would educate their youth. So the first Jesuit college in the broadest sense of being really like a high school, was open for lay students in Messina in 1548. And by the time Ignatius died in 1556, there were already about 40 colleges established and many more to come. The flagship of that fleet of colleges was the Roman College, the first chapel, a modest little building. Yet very soon, Pope Gregory XIII decides to enlarge that, basically erases a neighborhood, does a redevelopment program, and begins the construction of a massive complex that became a model of church and college around the world. Here, Gregory accepting and blessing the plans for colleges in Japan and in Lithuania and in Turkey. Those colleges, universities, secondary schools, some institutions of primary education, and a lot of seminaries, those became centers of learning, of Catholic learning throughout Europe and around the world. Those colleges extended as far as China and the ends of Latin America. They were also centers for art and persuasion. The Jesuits used the arts, the visual arts and dramatic arts, as ways of teaching and preaching the gospel. Especially important in the early years of the society, and approved by Ignatius himself, was the use of theater. And in fact, over the first 150 years or so of the Society of Jesus' existence, more than 100,000 plays were produced at colleges around the world. The college, with its connected church, became also an important center of religious devotion in major cities around the world, not only in Europe, but in Asia, in India, and in Latin America and the Philippines. The Jesuits were, by definition, missionaries. Ignatius took Jesus seriously when Jesus told his followers to go out to all the world and preach the gospel. And even before Ignatius's election as Superior General, Francis Xavier was making his way from Rome to Portugal, and thence from Portugal around first to India, and then finally going to Japan for a number of years, and dying off the Straits just across from China, which was his great desire. Beginning with Francis Xavier, one of Ignatius's most accomplished companions, he and his successors never hesitated to send some of their very best men to the missions as teachers, as preachers, as intellectuals, as artists, and as scientists. Jesuits became the imperial court astronomers at the court of the Chinese emperor, for example. Some of the earliest ethnography and cartography of the New World was done by Jesuit scholars as well, in addition to their missionary work. In the Americas, the Jesuits worked in Portuguese Brazil and Spanish Mexico, across South America. They crossed the Pacific to the Philippines, and in French Canada, in Protestant Maryland, and even in our own Baja California. Their works were multiformed, they were learned, they were simple, they were preaching the gospel in as many idioms as they could find. If I were asked what were Ignatius's defining virtues, the virtues of this man who dreamed great dreams even as he worked at his desk for most of his adult life, I would say that they are these. He was deeply spiritual. He was a man who was attuned to the actions of God in his life and in the lives of the people around him, deeply in love with God and deeply in love with Christ. He was deeply Catholic. He believed and followed and supported the Church, even while encouraging its reform. He never left behind the heart of his Catholic faith. He was immensely practical. He was a man who saw difficult situations and was able to figure out and innovate. He was flexible. He wasn't afraid to try new approaches to old problems or to encounter new problems with a deal of creativity and openness. In that, he was daring. He was not afraid of encountering the world as he found it, and very hopeful. Hopeful that finding the world as made in the image of God, even in its fallen condition, that God would continue to work in the world, and he hoped through his society and through the Church for the good of his fellow citizens. And finally, Ignatius was generous. He gave everything for love of God, for the greater glory of God, and for the good of souls. He died old and broken, but full of joy, on the 31st of July of 1556, which is still his feast day in the church calendar. I thank you for supporting the works of St. Ignatius Parish and encourage you to ask for the gifts of those same virtues of being deeply spiritual, deeply Catholic, practical and flexible, daring, hopeful, and generous in your service of God and for the good of your neighbors. Happy feast day to you all, and God bless you.